Thank you. Last speech at 4 minutes. Greg Hands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm starting off by answering my right honourable friend, the member for Rushcliffe, I think, who said he hadn't heard a single argument against a customs union. But I give him credit for staying for the whole debate, because I'm going to give him plenty. He mentioned that, Mr. Speaker, I've been involved in a filibuster, and I counted my contribution on the Business of the House motion at 1 minute 13 seconds. Now, Mr. Speaker, that must be perhaps the shortest filibuster there's ever been. I did once speak for 1 hour 43 minutes on beer duty, but I think 1 minute 13 doesn't really count. So why, Mr. Speaker, is a customs union a very bad idea? Broadly speaking, huge loss of control over our own economic policy, a decline on our foreign policy influence, and a huge democratic deficit. Trade policy, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is not just about trade deals. It is about much more that we would be handing over to the European Union without a seat at the table. There's tariffs, there is remedies, there is preferences, as well as trade agreements. All of this, Mr. Speaker, would be given over. The House of Commons would abrogate its responsibility in relation to the UK's trade policy. And this is not Andorra or San Marino, which are in customs unions at the moment with the European Union. This is the world's 5th largest economy. Now, he and I were on the same side in the referendum in 2016, so I'm not approaching this as some kind of Brexiteer. I'm approaching this, Mr. Speaker, as what makes sense for the UK for our trade policy. And it makes no sense in our democracy for this House of Commons tonight to vote to hand over control of UK trade policy to Brussels. That would mean that a Maltese commissioner, a Latvian MEP, a Portuguese commissioner, a Slovene MEP, they would all have more say over UK trade policy than any elected UK politician. That would include the UK Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. They would have more say over it. That is not democratically sustainable, nor is it sustainable for our foreign policy. He and I served in government together, and I went into various rooms, Mr. Speaker, in foreign countries, speaking to foreign governments. And trade is one of the aspects of leverage that you have. When we're members of the European Union, that will mean the UK's influence on EU trade policy. That is obviously going to be gone, but we'll have no influence over our own trade policy. We will be unable to have those conversations with the government of the United States and say, well, actually, if we can do this on some other area, we will have a word in Brussels on this particular trade issue. All of that will be good. Well, I'm not, because unlike my right honourable friend, I'll take an extra minute, yes.
I get you an extra minute, yeah. I'm very grateful, because I didn't have time to give way to him. But to say the British government, if we moved into a customs union, would have as little influence over deals being negotiated by the EU as a Latvian MP, I think you'll acknowledge, is a slight exaggeration. And as the spokesman for the opposition has said, a big economy like ours would add to the attractions of the EU market with a negotiating partner. We surely could put in place a structure giving us far more consultation, far more involvement in the negotiations than he is describing. Well, not as good as now, but perfectly adequate.
I think on his part, I have to say, I think that is wishful thinking. The European Union is highly likely to prioritise the interests of its members versus the interests of the non-members. That has always been the case. Also, there's serious arguments as to whether European Union rules would even allow a non-member to be of influence on EU trade policy. I'm afraid that is just a fact. So, Mr. Speaker, democratically unsustainable. On tariffs, we've got a position, Mr. Speaker, where tariffs will be set by people who are not accountable to this House or to our constituents. That could be very damaging. It could be damaging on goods coming into the country, where they set high tariffs on goods that our consumers would quite like to get access to, or it could happen the other way round with things like trade remedies, Mr. Speaker, which is briefly mentioned. Incredibly important. Trade defences. All of this would be handed over to Brussels. Now, Brussels might look after our trade remedies, but they would not give it priority. They would give the defence of their own industries, the fee-paying members of the European Union, the priority over countries like ours. So those all-important WTO investigations into, say, the UK ceramics industry, those would be relegated below investigations to protect, say, the German or Dutch steel industries. Mr. Speaker, on trade deals, you've got the case, the Turkey trap it is talked about. This is the asymmetry. The EU would offer access to our 65 million consumers without being able to achieve necessarily anything in return. And you could guarantee it that the UK asks would be the ones that will be dropped first, and the UK items of defence would be the ones the EU would concede first. That is inevitable, because we would not be a fee-paying member of the European Union. We would not be a priority for them. I'll give way, yes.
Saved him from the clock. I'm listening very carefully to my honourable friend, and I have a lot of respect for him, and I have read his article, and I've listened to every speech so far during today's debate. I understand what he doesn't want, which is the customs union. But bearing in mind that Parliament has yet to decide what it does, has rejected all other options, and the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement and political declaration, what is he arguing for?
I continue to argue, Mr. Speaker, for the Prime Minister's agreement, and that is where I think that we should head. I think that is the best compromise. People talk about a compromise. That is the best compromise that he and I have both voted for. Mr. Speaker, on a couple of other points in relation to trade agreements, I was astonished that the Labour front bench is supporting this idea of handing over our trade policy. They were the people most passionately against TTIP and other trade agreements due to the access it would supposedly have given foreign companies to the NHS. As it happens, Mr. Speaker, I don't buy into that idea. But the idea that now it's going to be fine because we're handing over trade policy to the EU, but we don't have a seat at the table, that, I'm afraid, is for the birds. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I think in terms of trade policy, I think it was Senator Elizabeth Warren who said, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're likely to be on the menu. And that is exactly what I fear will happen in an EU customs union if option C is passed this evening.
Thank you very much. Stephen Gethin.